Okay, so yesterday we just saw the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us something that was actually a discussion that we had seen before as a machlokes Rabbi and Shmuel. When you purchase wine and shortly after you purchase it, it goes bad, who's the responsible party? So one person was of the opinion that as soon as the buyer takes delivery, even a second after he purchases it, if it goes bad, too bad. It's the buyer's bad mazel. That was what we had seen previously. The other opinion was, no, within 3 days if it goes bad. Now, how that machlokes aligns with the machlokes that's in this Mishnah is something that the Rashbam undertakes. But keep that in mind when we look at the machlokes in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, in its ambiguous language, which needs to be more carefully defined. Thank you so much, Shmuel. Hamocher yain lechaveru vehechmitz. If a person sells wine to his friend and the wine goes bad, it turns into vinegar, after it's already in the buyer's possession, eino chayiv ba'achriyuso. The seller bears no responsibility. That was what we had seen yesterday at the bottom of Tzadi Zayin Amud Beis. However, v'im yadua sheyeno machmitz hareza mekachtos. If, however, it is known that it is wine that is prone to going bad, which means at the outset the seller already knew that this wine has very short shelf life. So if you don't chaperine really quick, it's going to turn to vinegar. So then the buyer could always argue that this was under false pretenses, this sale, and he wants his money back. Now, of course, there's a lot of ambiguity here. So now we need to see the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yossi, and by the way, that opinion that said that the buyer has always legal recourse, you'd have to say that when the Mishnah says that the seller is not responsible, it's only after the first 3 days. That would be according to Rav, and according to Shmuel, the seller has no responsibility immediately. But let's take a look at the Gemara. We'll get back to the rest of the Mishnah later on. Amar Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina lo shanu ela bekankanim de lo keach, aval bekankanim de mocher amar lei hachamrach v'hakankanach. So the only time that the seller can basically blow the buyer off is if the buyer takes delivery in his own containers. Because then the seller can say, your containers caused the wine to go bad. But if the buyer takes the seller's containers, like the way we buy product, it's sold in the containers of the seller. So then the buyer can say, I did nothing to this wine to tamper with it, and therefore take it back. And he has a right to say that. So the Gemara says, but even if it's the seller's containers, what right does the buyer have to say, I want my money back? Why can't the seller say to him, when you bought this wine, it was perfectly good. Who told you to keep it in your house for 6 months and wait for it to go bad? So the Gemara says, Lo tzricha da'amar leila mikpa. The answer is, and this is really all about expiration dates. You know, we've solved this problem in modern society with expiration dates, but the Gemara doesn't have expiration dates on wine. So the Gemara basically says, it depends what the terms of the sale were. If the terms of the sale were that the buyer and seller both agree that I'm buying this wine for long-term storage because I'm going to use it for cooking wine very sparingly to make sauce in my cooking, so then if the seller says, okay, it's perfectly good cooking wine, and then after 6 months it goes bad, so then the buyer has legal recourse. He can say, you sold it to me, you knew you were selling it to me for cooking, you knew that it needed to last a long time. Why did you sell me wine that quickly turns to vinegar? So the Gemara says, but this is so bizarre, Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina. Umay duchke de Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina le'ukam le'masnisin bekankanin de lo keach u'da amar le'la mikpa lukma bekankanin de mocher u'da lo amar le'la mikpa. So the question is, you, Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, agree that if it's the seller's containers, the buyer can basically demand his money back. You've already agreed to that. Well, then why do you have to say that we're talking about a case in our Mishnah and the reason why the buyer can demand his money back is because he says it was lemikva. Lukma bekankanim democher delomer le lemikva. Why don't you tell me that the case of the Mishnah is that we're dealing with the seller's containers, and that there was no statement that it was made lemikva. If the buying agreement never included that it was meant for long-term storage, then even you, Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina, agree that the buyer has no recourse regardless of whose containers it's in. Because if he didn't say lemikva, then the seller can say, who told you to keep it so long? Why then do you have to contrive the Mishnah to tell me that it's davka in a case where the containers belong to the buyer, so the buyer bears some responsibility, and even so, it's only in that situation. Why don't you tell me we're dealing with all situations that a seller can tell a buyer, sorry, you're not entitled to a refund because we never stipulated that it was going to be for long-term storage. And in that case, it wouldn't matter whether it's the buyer's containers or the seller's containers. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava Masnisan Kishise. The answer is because he looked at the language of the Mishnah and he couldn't, Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina said, there's no other way to understand the Mishnah because the Ketani, because look at the next line of the Mishnah. Im yadua shi'enu machmitz hareza mekach tos. That if the seller knew already that this brand of this harvest of grapes goes sour quickly and he still sold it to him for storage, so then the buyer can say it's a mekach tos because you knew in advance. You misrepresented the product. So amai leima lo yiboyelach l'shehuye elalav shmamina domer le'lemikva shmamina. So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina looks at that line in the Mishnah and he says, why can't the seller say to the buyer, yes, it's true, I knew that this wine spoils quickly, but who told you that you should store it for such a long period of time? If you would have drunk the wine quickly, like most people do when they buy wine, they drink it and they serve it to their guests right away, you wouldn't have had any problem. So Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina looks at that line in the Mishnah and says, why then should the seller assume any responsibility in that case? Why can't he say that? So it must be that the Mishnah is talking about a case where the buyer stipulated when he bought it that I want this for long-term storage. And if so, if you want it for long-term storage, then it depends. If you, the seller, don't know good from bad, so then it depends. If it's in the seller's containers, the buyer's entitled to a refund. If it's in the buyer's containers, the buyer's not entitled to a refund because the seller can say to him, maybe it's the bacteria in your containers that caused the wine to go bad. But if the seller knew at the very outset that no matter what, this wine's going to go sour quickly, and he sells it to you knowing that you want it for long-term storage, so then that's a mekach tos, and the buyer always has legal recourse to get his money back. But the bottom line is that you see from Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina that once the buyer takes delivery, if the buyer takes delivery and it's the seller's containers and it goes bad, the buyer is allowed to ask for a refund. But that argues upliga de Rav Chia bar Yosef. Amar Rav Chia bar Yosef chamra mazola de mare garim. Rav Chia bar Yosef says anytime a buyer takes possession of a product, no matter what, if it goes bad in his possession, provided that the seller didn't know explicitly that this is deliberately going to go bad, but it could have gone bad for any reason, once the buyer takes possession of it, it's his bad mazel, even if it's in the container of the mocher. It's got nothing to do with bacterial transfer. It's got to do with the fact that you have bad mazel. And therefore, Rav Chia would argue that even if the seller sells it in his own containers, but it was perfectly good when the buyer bought it, if 2 days later it goes bad, or a week later it goes bad, it's tough luck for the buyer. Now, even if it was stipulated that it was for lemikva, because the seller didn't know. Shenemar va'avki hayayin boged gever yahir v'goyim. So what does this pasuk say? This pasuk says that even wine will rebel against the haughty person, v'lo yinveh, and that person will not succeed. Now, if you look at the next part of the pasuk, in other words, basically what it's telling you is that it's your own fault that the wine went bad. Whoever owns wine that goes bad, unnaturally, it's because it's a sign that the wine is rebelling against a person who's unsavory in some way. So, Amar Rav Mari, Haiman de Yahir, Afilu Inshi Besi lo Mikbol Shenemar, Gever Yahir velo Yinveh. So, Milo Yinveh, my velo Yinveh, Binaveh Shalo, that if a person is haughty, then he won't even be accepted to his own navet, to his own household. And because the word naveh means household. And what do we mean by household? So the Rashbam says, even your wife won't respect you. If a person acts haughty, then even people who would normally respect the person will not respect him. Okay, very, very important lesson. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Kol HaMisgoeh B'Tala Shel Talmid Chacham Ve'enu Talmid Chacham Ein Machnisin Oso B'Mechitzaso Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Very important teaching. Any person who's haughty and wears the clothing of a Talmid Chacham when he really isn't deserving of that clothing will never enter into the inner sanctum of Hashem. The Rashbam said we had learned previously that a Talmid Chacham wears extra long clothing to cover his inner garment more than most people. So, unfortunately, if people learn this Gemara, all the Bekesha manufacturers would go out of business because, you got to really be a Talmid Chacham to deserve to wear the clothing of a Talmid Chacham. But yet, I just saw, there get a dozen for $100. Anyway, Ksiv Hacha v'lo yinveh, u'Ksiv Hasam el nevei kadshecha. So it's because, and how do we know that you don't enter into the inner sanctum? Because it says over here v'lo yinveh, that lo yinveh means he will not succeed, but the word naveh is also used in the context of Hashem's holy sanctum, so we see that he will not enter into the holy sanctum. So Amar Rava, Haiman dezavin lechavisa dechamer lechanua adaita lesabuya v'takif apalga o atilsa. So this is a classic case of selling on consignment, where basically Reuven is the manufacturer, Shimon is the retailer. Now, Shimon agrees to take Reuven's wine on consignment, meaning I'm not buying it from you and reselling it. It's still your wine, and whatever I can sell, I sell. Whatever I can't sell goes back to you. Okay? So, if that wine, so Shimon starts selling the wine in his store. He sells already a third of a barrel to different people because they bring their own bottles. And then he gets down to a two-thirds of the barrel, the wine spoils. So what's the halacha? Who has to assume responsibility for the spoilage? So dinahu de mekabel minei. So the halacha is that the manufacturer, Reuven, has to accept full responsibility because Shimon never took any level of possession or responsibility for the wine. He's basically doing Reuven a favor of selling it on consignment, but it's still Reuven's wine 100%. And therefore, Reuven has to take it back if it spoils. V'lo amron ela de lo shani bebar zelo shani bebar zelo. But that's provided that Reuven did not add his own spigot to the barrel. If Reuven added or tampered with the barrel in any way, then Shimon can claim that you bear at least partial responsibility for the spoilage of the wine because you introduced new bacteria, new air to the wine. V'lo amron ela de lo imata yoma d'shuka, v'mata yoma d'shuka lo. And furthermore, the only time Reuven is off the hook is if he did his due diligence and he brought the barrel to market at the marketplace day. But let's say he took a day off on the day that it was the day of the shuk, so that he really didn't sell as much as he could have because he didn't bring it to market, and then later it spoils. So then Shimon does have legal recourse to taina against Reuven. At least part of the responsibility for the spoilage is yours. Va'amar Rava, Haiman dekabel chamra daita demamti leparvasa deval shafat, va'adamati hasam zol. So let's take a look at the next case. This is not a case of consignment. This is a business deal. You've got a manufacturer and you've got a transporter. The manufacturer says, you know what, if we sell the wine here, it's only a 10% markup that we can get. But if we sell the wine in this place called Parvasa Deval Shafat, we can get a 50% markup because they knew that the price of wine was artificially inflated in this place called Parvasa Deval Shafat, whatever reason, maybe because the king made an edict about wine pricing or whatever it is. So they figured, let's schlep the wine. So they make a deal between themselves. I'll manufacture the wine, you transport it, and we'll split the difference. Now, in that kind of situation, there's a business partnership that's taking place. In this business partnership, the transporter is accepting some level of responsibility for the safe transportation and delivery of the wine. So the question is like this. What happens if en route to Parvasa Deval Shafat, the bottoms out on wine prices, so that even in that place, they're going to end up losing money because of the cost of manufacturing and transportation. So who incurs the loss? Is it purely the manufacturer or is it the transporter? So the Gemara says they have to split the losses. Because in this situation, it's not that the wine belongs exclusively to the manufacturer and Shimon has no stake in the wine. They've accepted a business partnership, and just like they were going to split the profits, they have to split the losses as well. Now, so therefore, dinahu de mekabele. So iboyalahu. But now the question is, hava chalamai. what happens if the wine, that's talking about if the price drops. What happens if the wine turns to vinegar? Does Shimon have a taina against Reuven that, hey, should have manufactured wine that you knew could last until I get to Parvosa de Valshafat? So, Amar le Rav Hillel le Rav Ashi ki havan be Rav Kahana Amar lan chala lo udalo ke Rabbi Yossi be Rabbi Chanina. So, Rav Hillel says that when I was by Rav Kahana, he said that when it comes to vinegar, the manufacturer does not accept all of the damage, because basically he can say to the transporter, once you took partial possession of it, it's just as much your bad mazel as my bad mazel, right? Because basically we're saying that since you're a partial owner, you're a stakeholder in this wine, it's just as much your bad mazel as it is mine, regardless of the fact that you didn't tamper with the contents at all. And v'ikada amri afilu chalanami mekabel kaman ke Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina. Others learn just the opposite, that it's exclusively the loss of the manufacturer, since the transporter didn't tamper with the wine at all, and the manufacturer knew that it had to be wine that would stay until he got to Parvasa de Valshafat, then it's purely the loss of the manufacturer, and the transporter is not liable at all. Now, Yashan Mishal Ishtakad B'chulek. The last part of the Mishnah had basically said like this, that if at the time of the sale, the seller represents not just that he's selling wine, but that he's selling Yashan, the first case was Yayin Mavusam. So Yayin Mavusam is quality wine. So quality wine implies a warranty that it's going to last at least until Shavuos. Now, when we say until Shavuos, we're assuming that wine is sold typically, when do they freshly press wine? Right after Sukkot, because they harvest the grapes over the summer, they bring them into the silo or whatever the storage area, and then they press the grapes around in Tishrei or shortly afterwards and manufacture it into wine. So when you sell yayin and call it yayin mevusam, that implies that you're giving a warranty that it's going to last longer than just a few days. And then if it turns to vinegar anytime between now and Shavuos, the buyer is entitled to a refund. Then the Mishnah had said that if you sell someone yayin yashan, you're representing that the wine is even longer lasting, because you're basically saying that it comes from last year's harvest, and therefore it's going to last for this entire season as well. And therefore it's got to be at least from last year's harvest, and it's got to last another year. And umiyushan mishal gimelshan. And if you represent the wine as miyushan, which is old wine, then it's got to come from 2 years ago harvest, okay? And it's got to last until at least the next until the year runs out. And Tana umiyashen v'holech ad hachag. And when you sell someone miyushan or yashan or miyushan wine, it has to last the full 3 years or the full 2 years. That's at least what it seems to me. When you sell someone miyushan wine, you're basically saying, I'm giving you an implicit warranty that this wine is from 2 seasons ago, and it'll last you a full year, not just until Shavuos, but until next Sukkot, until the next pressing season. So basically, this is just a question of how long does the warranty on wine last when you make certain representations. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Hamocher makom lechaveiro. The Bach just puts in the extra words, Laslos lo beis chasnus livno beis almanus livno, v'chein hamakabel mechaveiro, Laslos lo beis chasnus livno ubeis almanus levito. So the Mishnah is talking about the following 2 possibilities. Either I'm a landowner and I sell you property, and I basically, the deal is that you're buying enough property to build a domicile for the new wedding, the new nuptial home for the chassan and kala, or, and a guy's buying it for his son, because as we'll see, typically, when a bacher got married, they would just build an add-on room, like an attachment to the parents' house, to the boy's parents' house, and the son and daughter-in-law would live with the parents. That's why, by the way, what they do in Arab families even today. When what?
We're going to have to start doing it.
That's right. When the kids get married, the parents just add an attachment to the house. So if you're a landowner and you're selling an attachment, right, let's say to the chassan who's going to buy it with his own money, you have to provide him a certain minimum patch of land. And the question of the Mishnah is, what is represented, what's the minimum size you have to give to him. Or let's say you're a contractor, and you're hired to build a domicile for a chassan and kala for their new add-on attachment home. And the other option is that it's not a domicile for a chassan and kala, but it's a domicile for a widow. Because typically what would happen is if a girl's husband died, she would go back and live with her parents. So she would leave her husband's parents' home and go back to live with her parents. So in either way, you need a little bit of an adjunct structure. How large does that structure have to be? So the Mishnah says, Arba amos al sheish, 4 by 6 amos. And that's divrei Rabbi Akiva. It's according to Rabbi Akiva. Now, what is 4 amos? Is about 6 feet. 6 feet by about 9 feet. That's not a lot of space. It's like one single room. There's no bathroom. There's no kitchen. It's just basically there's no jacuzzi.
It's a bedroom.
It's basically a bedroom, right? And that's her entire living space, and that's according to Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Shmuel Oimer Refes Bakar Hizu. He says that's not a domicile. That's a barn, right? That's not adequate space. So I guess he was. Right. Anyway, Harod Salat Rabbi Akiva, lived in a barn. So, it's very interesting that they have this machlokas. Harod Salasos Refes Bakar, but if a person wants to build a barn, what are the dimensions? Bona Dal Amos al Sheish. It almost seems like this line of the Mishnah is ignoring the previous line. And that's what the Gemara is going to have to clarify. Who's saying these words? Is it Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Shmuel? If you want to build a barn, it seems like everyone agrees that it's got to be 4 by 6. Bayis katan sheish al ches. What if the deal with the contractor was, I'm going to build you a small house? Small house is 6 by 8 amos. Gadol ches al eser. A big house? What's a big house? 2,000 square feet? No. A big house is 8 by 10 amos. 8 by 10 amos. What's 8 by 10 amos? Maybe what?
30. So 600-700.
Someone calculated 450 square feet. It's not a lot. Ches amos
Smaller
is
than this room, half the size of this room.
right. It's smaller than the room that we're in.
When you define the amma as.
But that's a big house. Now trochlin. What if you order a trochlin, which is an atrium, some kind of atrium, which the Gemara will define? Yod al yod. That's 10 by 10. Now, rumo kechatzi orko ukechatzi rafa. Now, how high does the contractor have to build the ceiling? This is bizarre because our ceilings are not that high by comparison. You take half of the width and half of the length of the floor plan. You add them together to get the height of the ceiling. So it all depends on the floor, the dimensions, the horizontal dimensions of the house. The more the horizontal dimensions, the higher the ceiling. And it turns out that if you have a 10 by 10 amma trochlin, so you take half of 10 and half of 10 to get 10, you have to have a 10 amma ceiling. That's a huge ceiling. This ceiling is not 10 ammas. This ceiling is not even 10 feet. This ceiling is 8 feet, 9 feet at the most? That standard ceilings are 8 feet high. So it sounds like it's very disproportionate. We're used to much more expansive space horizontally and much less of a ceiling height vertically. So Raya L'Davar, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Oimer Kebinyan Ahechel. And to sort of demonstrate this point, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, take a look at the way that the temple was constructed, and you'll see that it was that way as well. The Heichal, the outer portion of the covered part of the temple, was 40 by 20. Those were its dimensions. And how high was the ceiling? So the pasuk says it was 30. This is Solomon's temple. So you take half of 40 and half of 20. You add them together and you get 30. So you see that the ceiling height is half the width and half the length. Okay, so the Gemara now says, Lama li lemisna beis chasnus livno beis almonos levito, lisni beis chasnus livno levito beis almonos livno levito. So the Gemara says, why did the Mishnah seemingly arbitrarily choose the example of building a wedding home for your son or a widow home for your daughter? You should have just said more simply, if you're building a wedding home or a widow home for your son or your daughter. Wouldn't that be much more direct? So the Gemara says, Milsa agav orche kamash malon, v'lo darka l'chasna l'mei darbei chamua. So it's telling me laws of derech eretz, that it is not proper for a son-in-law to live in his in-law's house. Why is that? And this is, by the way, the Rashbam says this refers most specifically to the first son-in-law. The first son-in-law that a woman has, there's a natural attraction, and an emotional and perhaps even a physical attraction between the mother-in-law and the son-in-law. And therefore, in order to avoid any problems, a son-in-law should not live with his in-laws when he first gets married. This is so contrary to all of the stereotypes of Jewish mothers-in-law, but that's just the way Chazal look at it. Now, Kiddichsiv b'Sefer Ben Sira, and this is also recorded in the book called Ben Sira, which is part of the Apocrypha, which basically means that it was written. Ben Sira, according to legend, was the son of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, and he was a very wise man. And within his Sefer contains prophetic words that are written with Ruach HaKodesh, and words that are written just out of wisdom without Ruach HaKodesh. And therefore Chazal decided not to canonize it because it's not completely holy inspiration. But it does contain a lot of wisdom nonetheless. And what is one of the things that Ben Sira writes? He says, Hakol shakalti b'chaf moznayim, v'lo matzasi kal misubin. He says, I've weighed everything on a scale. The lightest of everything, meaning the thing that's the poorest of quality, is bran. Bran is a very poor quality. It's sort of the discard of grain. The kal misubin chasna dar beveis chamev. But even more poor quality is a son-in-law who lives with his in-laws, right? The kal mechasan areach machnas orech, and even poorer quality than that, like poorer form than that, is if a guest invites another guest to stay with his host. In other words, oh, I'm staying by Yankel. Come, you can join us as well. Right? I'm having lunch at Yankel's house. I'm sure he doesn't mind if you join. Right? Okay. Ever have that happen to you? V'kal me oreach meishiv davar b'terem yishma. And even worse than that is if a person responds before the other person had a chance to finish their sentence or their question. Shene'amar meishiv davar b'terem yishma ivelasi lo uchlima. As the pasuk in Mishlei says, that if a person responds before hearing out the other person first, he's going to respond in a corruptive way, and it's shameful.
So we're not worried about fathers-in-laws and daughters-in-laws.
That's right. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting?
You'd think there'd be more.
Yeah.
It's very rare that we quote the Gemara as Ben Sira.
It happens though a few times. Yeah. Just to respond to what Gershon is saying, it's also by the way the laws of Yichud are not balanced in the same way. If you think about it, the assumption being by Chazal that women are more easily seduced than men, which is unusual when you think about society's views on the matter today. Okay. Anyway, Rabbi Shmuel Omer Refis Baker Hizu Harotza Lasos Chule. Now, the strange back and forth in the Mishnah at the beginning, where Rabbi Shmuel disagreed with Rabbi Akiva's dimension, he said that's a barn. And then the Mishnah just said, oh, by the way, if you want to make a barn, it's 4x6 also. So, like, who's making that statement? Refis Bakar Man Katanila. So who's the author of that statement? Ika Dama Rabbi Shmuel Katanila, Ika Dama Rabbi Akiva Katanila. Some say it's Rabbi Shmuel, and some say it's Rabbi Akiva. Ika Dama Rabbi Akiva Katanila v'hachi kamer. Some say Rabbi Akiva said it. And what he means to say is as follows. Afal pisha refes bakar he pa'amim shadam osa diraso ke refes bakar. The Rabbi Akiva was basically saying, I concede to you, Rabbi Shmuel, that 4x6 really also is the size of a barn, but there are times in people's lives when they subsist on a barn-sized house. And Rabbi Akiva himself probably had that experience when he and his wonderful wife, Rachel, lived in a barn. V'ika da Amar Rabbi Shmuel Katani lavahachi ka'amar shaharot zelasos refes bakar osa arba amos al sheish. And others learned that Rabbi Shmuel says it. Basically, Rabbi Shmuel says a 4x6 is not a place where two people can live. That's a barn. Because when you want to make a barn, it's 4x6. And essentially what Rabbi Shmuel is saying is that I'm not going to tell you in this Mishnah what I hold the dimensions are, but I can tell you what the dimensions are not. That a house, according to me, has got to be bigger than that. But he's not quoted as far as what his shita is in the Mishnah, according to this. Now, traklin yud al yud. A traklin is 10 by 10. So the Gemara says, my traklin, kuvsa bevardi. It is, what is a traklin? It is an atrium that is filled with windows to let a lot of light in. And the windows are filled with roses, or maybe rose-like structures or sculptures. It's not really clear. And apparently this was used as a meeting place for dignitaries.
So therefore, if you want to know what it is, when you order it, you'll know halachically what the language is. Now, v'tani, v'kantir shteimisrei al shteimisrei. There's a brisa that says that if you order a kantir from a contractor, you're entitled to a space of 12 by 12, which is even larger than a trochlin. So my kantir tarbeitz apadni. It is a palace, a palatial atrium that is called a tarbeitz also because, so the Rashbam says the word tarbeitz comes from the word to be rovetz, which is to sprinkle the earth with water because otherwise dust will come up because it's such a large floor space. Okay. Rumo kechatzi orko kechatzi rachbo, raya l'davar Shimon Gamliel omer kibinyan ha'heichel. Now, the height of a structure has to be the sum of half the width and half the length. And what's the proof? Shimon Gamliel says from the Beis HaMikdash. Now, Raya l'davar man ketanila. So the Gemara is bothered by the sentence structure of this line of the Mishnah as well. Because normally, if Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was going to be making a statement, it would have read like this. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel oimer Raya l'davar mi binyan ha'heichel. Right? He would start off by saying, how do you prove this? From the construction of the temple. But that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says, Raya l'davar. What's the proof? From Shimon Gamliel oimer mi binyan ha'heichel. It asks the question before quoting Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and that's what the Gemara is bothered with. Like, why is it structured in that way? So who is saying those words Raya l'davar? So Ika da Amrar Rabbi Shimon Gamliel ketani la v'hachi ka'amar Raya l'davar minayin Amar Rabbi Shimon Gamliel akol kebinyan heichel. That Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is coming to support the Tanakama, and he's basically asking the question. You want to know where you can prove that the ceiling has to be that high? Says Rabbi Shimon Gamliel from the construction of the temple. That's one way of learning it. V'ika do'amar tanakama ketani la, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel atmui kamat mavachi kamalei l'tanakama. Raya minayin mebinan heichel atu kuliyama kebinan heichel avdi? Question mark. Some say that no, Raya l'davar was the Tanakama speaking. And by the way, I'll prove it to you that the ceiling has to be so high. And before the Tanakama could finish his sentence, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel interjects and says, what, you're going to prove it from the temple? Who needs a house that's as palatial and as opulent as the temple? Since when do people live in homes that are so exactly imitative of the temple, that it has to have such high ceilings? So Tanya, and by the way, that makes more sense from our perspective because our ceilings are never as high as that. So Acherim Oimrim Rumo Korosa, that there's a shita of the Acherim that seems to be different from anything that we've seen so far, which is that they say, take a look at the length of the, not the length, but the width of the house, where you have the cross beams. And if you take a look at the width of the house where the cross beams are placed on the roof, that'll tell you how high the ceiling has to be. Seemingly sounding like it has to be if you have two dimensions, length and width. Length is usually longer, width is shorter. Take the width, the shorter horizontal measurement, and make the ceiling that high. So in the way that they say it is that you take the length of the cross beam, or the ceiling beam. And the question now that the Gemara asks is, V'lema rumo kirachba. Why not just say that the height of the ceiling is the width of the house? Why do you have to put it in terms of the cross beam? So ibayis ema besa mi'iloi ravach. So one answer is because if I just told you that the height of the ceiling has to be the width, there are some times when the width at the bottom of the structure is different from the width at the top of the structure, because you can create tapered walls, like building a pyramid, where the walls move inwards. They used to build a lot of structures that way, not ending necessarily at a point, but certainly the walls tapering upwards to provide reinforcement for the roof. And so therefore, if I just told you that the height of the ceiling has to be the width, you wouldn't know is that the width measured from the floor or the width measured from the roof. You wouldn't know. So therefore, I'm telling you it's the cross beam to tell you that's the width measured from the roof. So that would be one answer. And another answer is Iba Yasema Mishum Diika Be Kavi. The answer is because the cross beam is a little bit longer than the width of the walls, because in order to get the cross beam positioned properly and firmly ensconced, you have to drill holes into the wall itself to make room for the beam to rest upon. So we're telling you that even though the walls themselves may be a few inches shorter, right, the ceiling beam is even longer than that, and that's got to be the height of the ceiling. Okay. And Rabbi Chanina nafak l'kiryasa ramale kroya hadari. Now, Rabbi Chanina once went to a village, and the people of the townsfolk raised a contradiction in the psukim in Sefer Malachim. It says, Ksiv v'habayis asher bana hamelech shlomo l'Hashem shishim ama orko ve'esrim rachbo shloshim ama komaso. There's one pasuk that takes the floor plan of the entire covered part of the temple, which is both the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and it says that it was 60 by 20 with a ceiling height of 30. Now, I told you before that it was 40 by 20 because that's only the Heichal, not taking into account the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which is 20 by 20. But when you put the two of them together, the full length is 60, right? But so one pasuk implies that the whole structure had a ceiling of 30, right? Both the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But uchasiv lifnei hadavir esrim ama orich ve'esrim ama rocha ve'esrim ama komaso. But then when the later pasuk talks about the height of the ceiling only of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it lists it as being 20 amos high. So it's a stira. Was the ceiling of the Kodesh HaKadoshim 30, like the rest of the Heichal, or was it 20, like this pasuk implies? So Amar Lahu ki kachashiv misfas kruvim ulomayla. So the answer is that really the ceiling height was uniform of 30 for the entire covered portion. But the measurement of 20 is taking 20 amos of airspace above the kruvim, above the angel statues. Because the angel statues were 10 amos high, and then above them was 20 amos of airspace. Now, my kamashmalan, so why are you listing it in that bizarre way? Just say it's 30, so it's like you said before. HaKamashmalan lamata kilamayla. Malamayla ein mishamish klum, af lamata ein mishamish klum. It's to tell you that there was a miracle that took place with the kruvim. As we're going to learn in tomorrow's Gemara, there was a miracle of physics that took place in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Now, in order to understand this, first you have to appreciate that the kruvim that Shlomo built were different from the kruvim that Moshe built. Moshe's kruvim were much smaller. They rested on top of the ark cover. The kruvim that Shlomo built were statues that started on the ground and hovered over the ark, completely covering it. But what the miracle was is that the kruvim in the Aron did not occupy any physical space. Remember I told you that it was 20 by 20? If you would take a tape measure and measure from the wall to one of the kruvim, it would measure 10 amos. If you'd measure with a tape measure from the wall on the other side to the other kruv, it would also measure 10 amos, which means that the kruvim in the ark had a dimension of 0, which is impossible. That's part of the miracle that existed in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and therefore the pasuk is telling you that just like there was no mass that took up any space in the airspace in the 20 amos above the kruvim, so too the mass of the kruvim did not take up any space where they were actually residing. And that's a miracle. And we'll talk more about that in Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.